The beam from my phone's flashlight cut through the darkness of Riverside Cemetery, illuminating rows of headstones that stretched into the fog like silent witnesses to whatever I was about to discover. It was 2:15 in the morning, and I was standing alone in a graveyard because 30 minutes ago, my dead mother's phone number had called me. Not a similar number, not a mistake. Her actual number, the one that had been disconnected 3 days ago when we canceled her cell service after the funeral. The funeral that my father had refused to attend. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely keep the light steady as I walked toward her grave. Fresh dirt still piled around the edges where they had lowered her casket just 12 hours earlier. The voice on the phone had been distorted, mechanical, but the words had been clear enough. Come to the cemetery, alone. Your mother left something for you. Something your father does not want you to find. And then the line had gone dead. I should have called the police. I should have woken up my sister or my uncle or literally anyone else instead of driving to a cemetery in the middle of the night based on a call from a dead woman's phone. But something in that distorted voice had convinced me this was real, that there was something here I needed to see, something that would explain the wrongness I had felt surrounding my mother's death from the very beginning. Something that would explain why my father, who had been married to my mother for 32 years, had chosen a business trip over her funeral. But to understand why I was standing in a graveyard at 2 in the morning, why I believed that my dead mother had left me a message, why I knew in my gut that my father was hiding something terrible, I need to take you back 3 weeks. Back to when my mother was still alive and everything started to unravel. My name is Nathan Pierce. I am 29 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I worked as a software engineer in Seattle while my parents lived their quiet retirement life in Portland, 2 hours south. My father, Richard Pierce, had been a corporate accountant his entire career. My mother, Elizabeth, had been a nurse for 40 years before retiring 5 years ago. They lived in the same house where my sister Claire and I grew up, and from the outside, their life looked exactly like what a successful middle-class American retirement should look like. Comfortable house paid off, decent retirement savings, good health insurance, plans for travel and grandchildren, and all the things people work their whole lives to achieve. What I did not know, what none of us knew, was that my father had been living a double life for the past 3 years. And my mother had discovered the truth 2 weeks before she died. The call came on a Tuesday evening in late September. My sister Claire, calling from Portland with that tight, controlled voice she uses when she is trying not to fall apart. Nathan, you need to come home. It is Mom. She is in the hospital. My mother had collapsed at home that afternoon. Sudden, catastrophic brain hemorrhage. By the time the ambulance got her to the hospital, the doctors were saying words like massive damage and unlikely to recover and making her comfortable. I was in my car within 10 minutes, driving south on I-5 with my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. 2 hours of processing the impossible reality that my perfectly healthy, active, vibrant 63-year-old mother was dying. When I got to the hospital, Claire was in the waiting room with our Uncle Tom, my mother's brother. She looked like she had aged 10 years in the past few hours. She stood up when she saw me, and I could see she had been crying for so long that her eyes were swollen nearly shut. Her hands were shaking as she reached for me, and when I hugged her, I could feel her entire body trembling. They said it was massive, she whispered into my shoulder. The hemorrhage. They said even if they could operate, there would be so much brain damage that she would never be herself again. Never wake up. Never recognize us. Where is Dad? Was the first thing I asked when I pulled back from the hug. He is with her, Claire said, wiping at her eyes with a tissue that had been shredded from overuse. They are letting him stay in the room. He has been in there for 3 hours. He told us to wait out here. Something about that bothered me, though I could not articulate why at the time. My mother was dying, and my father was excluding his children from being with her in her final moments, claiming the tragedy as his alone, shutting us out of our own grief. Uncle Tom stood up and shook my hand, then pulled me into a rough hug. He had always been more of a father figure to me than my actual father, more present and emotionally available. "I am so sorry, Nathan. Your mother was the best sister anyone could ask for. The best person I have ever known. What happened? How did this happen? She was fine yesterday. She was healthy." "They do not know," Uncle Tom said, his voice rough with emotion. "The doctors said sometimes these things just happen. An aneurysm or a weak blood vessel that suddenly ruptures. No warning, no symptoms, just sudden catastrophic failure." We waited. Hours passed in that strange suspended reality that hospitals create, where time moves differently and everything feels both hyper-real and completely surreal. Doctors came and went with updates that were not really updates, just different ways of saying that my mother was dying and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Nurses checked on us with practiced sympathy, offering coffee and water and words of comfort that could not possibly comfort anyone in our situation. Uncle Tom made coffee runs that none of us drank, just needing something to do with his hands, some way to feel useful in a situation where nothing useful could be done. And then, around midnight, my father emerged from my mother's room. He looked terrible, but something about his expression was off in a way I could not quite identify. Not devastated, not even particularly sad, just tired, inconvenienced. I watched him carefully as he approached us in the waiting room. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened, but his eyes were dry, completely dry. I had been crying on and off for hours. Claire had cried so much her face was swollen. Uncle Tom had tears in his eyes even as he tried to stay strong for us. But my father's eyes were clear and focused, like he had just come from a business meeting rather than watching his wife of 32 years take her last breath. "She is gone," he said flatly. "The doctors said it was quick. She did not suffer." The words came out rehearsed, mechanical, like he had practiced them in the mirror, like he was delivering a prepared statement rather than sharing devastating news about the woman he supposedly loved. Claire broke down crying, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Uncle Tom put his arm around her, murmuring comforting words while his own voice broke. I just stood there, staring at my father, watching him watch Claire's breakdown with an expression that looked more like impatience than sympathy. "I need to go home and get some sleep," my father continued. "We can talk about arrangements tomorrow." "You are leaving?" I said, and my voice was hard. "Right now. There is nothing more I can do here, Nathan. Your mother is dead. Staying in this hospital is not going to change that. We have not even talked about what happens next, about arrangements, about informing people, about any of the 1,000 things that need to be done when someone dies. We can talk about that tomorrow. I need to get some sleep." I stepped closer to him, close enough that he had to look directly at me instead of past me. "Dad, your wife of 32 years just died, the mother of your children, your partner for most of your adult life, and you are leaving the hospital 20 minutes later because you need sleep." Something flickered across his face. Anger, maybe, or fear at being challenged. "Everyone grieves differently, Nathan. You do not get to tell me how to feel or how to act. I am not telling you how to grieve. I am telling you that your behavior is strange and hurtful and does not make any sense. I do not owe you an explanation for my choices." His voice was getting louder now, attracting glances from the nurses at the station down the hall. "I am your father. I am the parent here, and I am telling you that I am going home to sleep, and we will discuss everything else tomorrow." Claire put her hand on my arm, a silent plea to let it go, to not make this worse than it already was. Uncle Tom was watching my father with an expression I could not quite read, something between concern and suspicion. "Fine," I said finally. "Go home. Sleep. We will handle everything here without you, just like we always do." He left. He actually left the hospital within 15 minutes of his wife's death, leaving his 2 children and his brother-in-law to deal with the immediate aftermath. He left while my mother's body was still in that room, while the nurses were disconnecting machines and preparing to call the morgue. Claire was too grief-stricken to find it strange. Uncle Tom was too focused on taking care of her. But I found it strange. Very strange. I found it even stranger the next morning when I went to my parents' house to help my father with funeral arrangements and found him on the phone in his study, speaking in the kind of low, intimate tone that I had never heard him use with my mother. I know, he was saying. "I will be there as soon as I can. Just give me a few days to get through this. I love you too." He hung up quickly when he realized I was standing in the doorway. "Who was that?" I asked. "Client. Work thing. Nothing important." "Dad, you have been retired for 5 years. What client?" "Consulting work. I have been doing some consulting." He stood up, his body language defensive. "Did you need something, Nathan?" I let it go in that moment because my mother had just died and I did not have the emotional energy to push. But I filed it away. That strange phone call and my father's obvious lie about consulting work he had never mentioned before. The next few days were a blur of funeral planning. Claire and I handled most of it because my father seemed weirdly checked out of the entire process. He would show up when required, make decisions when pressed, but it was like he was operating on autopilot. Like he was present in body but completely absent in spirit. My sister thought it was shock, that he was processing grief in his own way. Uncle Tom thought he was just being typical Richard, emotionally distant and uncomfortable with displays of feeling. But I was starting to think it was something else entirely. It was during one of those funeral planning meetings that I really started to get suspicious. We were at the funeral home, sitting with the director to discuss my mother's service, and my father kept checking his phone. Not occasionally, constantly. Every few minutes, he would glance at the screen, sometimes smiling slightly at what he saw before quickly putting it away. "Dad, can you please focus?" I finally said after the 3rd or 4th time he checked his phone while the funeral director was explaining cremation options. "We are planning Mom's funeral. I am focused," he snapped. "I can listen and check my phone at the same time." "Who keeps texting you?" "Nobody. Work emails." "You are retired. I told you I am doing consulting work. Can we please just focus on this?" After the meeting, I followed him to the parking lot. "Dad, what is going on with you? Mom just died and you are acting like you are mildly inconvenienced instead of devastated. You are checking your phone every 2 minutes. You left the hospital 20 minutes after she passed. What is happening?" He turned to face me, and for a moment, I saw something in his expression that looked almost like guilt. But then it was gone, replaced by defensive anger. "Everyone grieves differently, Nathan. Just because I am not falling apart in public does not mean I am not sad. Your mother and I were married for 32 years. I loved her, but I also need to keep living, keep functioning, keep handling the practical realities of life. Someone has to be the strong one." "The strong one?" "Dad, Claire is planning the entire funeral. I am handling all the legal paperwork and insurance claims. Uncle Tom is dealing with the extended family. What exactly are you being strong about? I do not need to justify my grief to you." He got in his car and drove away, leaving me standing in the parking lot with a growing certainty that something was very, very wrong. I called my sister that night and told her about my concerns. She did not want to hear it. "Nathan, everyone handles death differently. Maybe Dad is just one of those people who shuts down emotionally when something traumatic happens. You cannot judge him for not grieving the way you think he should grieve. It is not about how he is grieving, Claire. It is about how he is acting. The constant phone checking, the mysterious calls, the total lack of involvement in planning Mom's funeral. Something is off. You are looking for problems because you are upset and you need someone to be angry at. Dad is not the enemy here. Death is the enemy. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to accept that I was just projecting my own grief and confusion onto my father's behavior. But I could not shake the feeling that there was more to this story than a sudden brain hemorrhage and a husband who was emotionally distant in his grief. 2 days before the funeral, I did something I am not proud of. I waited until my father left the house for what he said was an errand, and then I went into his study and searched through his desk. I was not even sure what I was looking for. Evidence of the consulting work he kept mentioning? An explanation for his strange behavior? Some kind of hidden financial problem that would explain why he seemed so distracted? I started with the obvious places. The desk drawers, looking through folders of old bills and tax documents and insurance policies. Nothing unusual. Then I checked his computer, but it was password protected in a way it never had been before. My father had always been casual about technology security, had used the same password for everything, had never seemed concerned about privacy. Now suddenly his computer was locked down tight. That in itself felt like evidence of something. I moved on to the filing cabinet in the corner of his study, going through medical records and investment statements and mortgage documents. Everything looked normal on the surface. A life documented in paper, 32 years of marriage reduced to folders and files. And then, in the back of the bottom drawer, hidden under a stack of old tax returns from the early 2000s, I found something that did not belong. A shoebox, taped shut, heavy with contents I could not identify from the outside. My hands were shaking as I pulled the tape off and opened the box. Inside was the burner phone, along with a stack of receipts from hotels I did not recognize. Restaurant charges from cities my father had supposedly never visited, and a second driver's license with my father's photo but a different name. Richard Vincent instead of Richard Pierce. An address in Nevada that I had never heard him mention. What I found was worse than any of those things. In the back of his desk drawer, hidden under a stack of old tax documents, I found a burner phone. One of those cheap prepaid phones that you can buy at any convenience store, the kind people use when they do not want their regular phone records to show their activities. I turned it on and it had one contact saved. Just a first name, Vanessa. The text message history with Vanessa went back 3 years. 3 years of intimate messages. 3 years of I love yous and I miss yous and I cannot wait to see yous. 3 years of planning secret meetings and weekend getaways and building a whole relationship that had nothing to do with my mother. 3 years of my father cheating on my mother while she thought they were living their happy retirement together. And then, 2 weeks before my mother's death, I found this exchange. My father, Elizabeth knows. I do not know how, but she knows. She confronted me this morning. Vanessa, what did you tell her? My father. I tried to deny it, but she had evidence. She said she has been suspecting for months and hired someone to follow me. She has photos, Vanessa. Photos of us together. Vanessa. Oh my God. What are you going to do? My father. I do not know. She says she wants a divorce. She is going to tell the kids. She is going to ruin everything. Vanessa. Maybe this is for the best. Maybe now we can finally be together openly. My father. You do not understand. The house is in both our names. My retirement accounts are joint. She could take half of everything I have. More than half if she can prove infidelity. I cannot afford a divorce, Vanessa. I cannot afford to let her destroy what I have built. Vanessa, so what are you saying? My father, I am saying I need time to figure this out. I need to find a way to make this situation work in my favor. The messages stopped after that. 2 weeks of silence, and then my mother collapsed with a brain hemorrhage. I stood in my father's study, holding that burner phone, and felt my entire understanding of reality shift. My mother had not died from natural causes or bad luck or random medical tragedy. My mother had died 2 weeks after confronting my father about his affair, 2 weeks after threatening to divorce him and take half his assets. And my father, who had been so strangely calm about her death, who had been so distracted and distant, who kept checking his phone and making private calls, had apparently been more worried about losing money in a divorce than about his wife discovering his betrayal. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what to do with this information. So I took photos of the text messages with my own phone, put the burner phone back exactly where I found it, and left my father's house. I spent the next day trying to decide whether I was being paranoid or rational. Brain hemorrhages happen. People die suddenly all the time from natural causes. Just because my father was cheating and my mother threatened divorce did not mean he had somehow caused her death. But the timing, the suspicious timing of it all. 2 weeks after she threatened to expose him and take his money, she suddenly dies from a catastrophic brain event? That felt like more than coincidence. I needed to know more about how she died. So I called the hospital and asked to speak with the doctor who had treated her. Dr. Sarah Chun, a neurologist who had been on duty when my mother was brought in. I am sorry for your loss, Dr. Chun said when she got on the phone. Your mother's case was particularly tragic because there were no warning signs. Brain hemorrhages can happen to anyone, but they are especially shocking when the patient has no history of hypertension or other risk factors. But she did have a history of high blood pressure, I said, remembering her medication. She has been taking blood pressure medication for years. According to her medical records, her blood pressure was well controlled with medication. Her last checkup 2 months ago showed completely normal readings. This hemorrhage was sudden and catastrophic, not the result of chronic high blood pressure. In fact, her blood pressure medication should have reduced her risk of this type of event, not increased it. So what caused it? Dr. Chun paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. Sometimes these things just happen, Mr. Pierce. A weak blood vessel in the brain, genetic factors we do not fully understand, environmental stressors we cannot predict. The brain is incredibly complex, and even with all our medical advances, there is still so much we do not know about why some people experience these catastrophic events while others do not. But, I pressed, sensing there was more she was not saying. But in your mother's case, there was something unusual that we noted in the autopsy report. Something that raised some questions for the pathologist who performed the examination. My heart started pounding. What kind of unusual? Her blood work showed elevated levels of a medication she was not prescribed. Specifically, blood thinners. Warfarin at levels that would be considered dangerous for someone not being actively monitored for clotting disorders. The levels were high enough that they should have been causing noticeable symptoms like excessive bruising or bleeding from minor cuts. I do not understand. Why would she have blood thinners in her system if she was not prescribed them? That is what puzzled us as well. We asked your father if she might have been taking someone else's medication by mistake, perhaps mixing up her pills with his if he was taking similar medications. But he said she was very careful about her prescriptions, that she kept them organized in a weekly pill container and never made mistakes. He could not think of any reason she would have access to warfarin, and he claimed he was not taking any blood thinners himself. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. And what would those elevated levels do? Warfarin is a powerful anticoagulant, a blood thinner. At therapeutic levels, when properly monitored, It prevents dangerous blood clots from forming in people who are at risk for strokes or heart attacks. But at elevated levels, especially in someone not being monitored regularly with blood tests, it significantly increases the risk of bleeding. Any kind of bleeding, a small cut that would normally clot in a few minutes might bleed for an hour. A minor bump that would cause a small bruise might cause extensive bruising. And most dangerously, it increases the risk of internal bleeding, including bleeding in the brain. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Are you saying the blood thinners caused her brain hemorrhage? I am saying they may have been a contributing factor. A brain hemorrhage can happen on its own, but elevated levels of warfarin would have made any bleeding much worse and much harder to stop. If she had even a small bleed in her brain, the warfarin would have turned it into a catastrophic event. Did you report this to anyone? The police? Medical examiner? We noted it in the autopsy report, but without evidence of foul play, there was nothing for law enforcement to investigate. People accidentally take the wrong medication all the time. It is tragic but not criminal. After I hung up with Dr. Chun, I sat in my car for a long time, trying to process what I had just learned. My mother had died from a brain hemorrhage that was likely caused or worsened by blood thinners she should not have been taking. Blood thinners that had somehow gotten into her system shortly before she died. Shortly after she had threatened to divorce my father and take his money. I needed more information. I needed to know if my father had access to warfarin, if there was any way he could have given it to her without her knowledge. So I called my mother's pharmacy and asked about her prescriptions. Elizabeth Pierce, the pharmacist confirmed. Yes, she had regular prescriptions for blood pressure medication and cholesterol medication. Both were filled on schedule every month. Nothing for blood thinners? No warfarin or similar medications? No, nothing like that in her file. But I do see that we filled a warfarin prescription for Richard Pierce about 4 months ago. My hands went numb. My father has a prescription for warfarin? Yes, for a blood clot issue he was dealing with. It was a 3-month supply, should have run out about a month ago. Is he due for a refill? No, I just wanted to verify the prescription. Thank you. My father had warfarin. He had access to the exact medication that had been found in my mother's system at dangerous levels. He had motive to want her dead before she could file for divorce and expose his affair. And he had been acting strangely detached about her death from the very beginning. I was not paranoid. I was not making connections where none existed. My father had murdered my mother. The funeral was scheduled for the next day, and I had no idea what to do with the information I had gathered. I could not go to the police without more evidence. I could not confront my father without knowing how dangerous he might be. I could not tell my sister without proof because she would never believe me. So I decided to wait, to observe, to see what my father would do next. What he did next was announce, the morning of my mother's funeral, that he would not be attending. Claire and I were at my parents' house, getting ready for the service, when my father came downstairs with a suitcase. I am not going to make it to the funeral, he said casually, like he was announcing a change in lunch plans. I have an urgent business trip that I cannot postpone. I will be back in a few days. Claire's face went white. You are missing Mom's funeral? For a business trip. It is a consulting opportunity that has been in the works for months. The client is very important and the timing cannot be changed. Your mother would understand that sometimes work has to come first. Would she? I said, and my voice was hard. Would Mom really understand her husband missing her funeral for a consulting job? Your mother was always practical about these things. She knew that financial security requires making sacrifices sometimes. Financial security, I repeated. Is that what this is about? Money? Something shifted in his expression, just for a moment. A flash of defensiveness, maybe guilt. I am sorry if you and your sister do not approve of my choices, but I am still the head of this family, and I will make the decisions I think are best. I will be back in 3 days." He walked out the door with his suitcase, got in his car, and drove away from his wife's funeral. Claire was sobbing. Uncle Tom, who had witnessed the whole thing, looked like he wanted to punch something, and I was standing there with the absolute certainty that my father was not going on a business trip at all. He was running away with Vanessa while his wife's body was being buried, the same woman he had likely murdered to avoid losing money in a divorce. The funeral was beautiful and heartbreaking. All of my mother's friends and family were there, sharing stories about how kind she was, how caring, how dedicated to her work as a nurse and her role as a mother. Everyone kept asking where my father was, and we made up polite lies about an unavoidable work commitment because we were too humiliated to tell the truth. After the service, after my mother's casket had been lowered into the ground at Riverside Cemetery, after everyone had paid their respects and gone home, I stood at her grave and made a promise to her. "I am going to prove what he did, Mom. I am going to make sure he does not get away with this." That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the evidence I had, about what I knew and what I could prove. I had the texts showing the affair and my mother's threat of divorce. I had the timing of her death. I had the warfarin in her system and my father's prescription for the same medication. But none of it was enough for the police to open an investigation, especially not without my father's body to examine more thoroughly. Around 2 in the morning, I was lying in bed at Claire's house, where I was staying during my time in Portland, when my phone rang. I looked at the screen and felt my heart stop. The caller ID showed my mother's name and number, the number that had been disconnected 3 days ago when we canceled her cell service. I answered with shaking hands. "Hello." A distorted voice processed through some kind of voice modulator came through the phone. "Nathan Pierce." "Yes. Who is this? How are you calling from this number?" "Your mother left something for you. Something she wanted you to have if anything happened to her. Come to Riverside Cemetery. Come alone. Do not tell your father. Do not tell anyone. What did she leave? What is this about?" She knew she was in danger. She took precautions. Come to her grave. Look for the stone angel 3 graves to the left. Underneath the angel's base, there is a plastic container. Inside is what your mother wanted you to find. How do I know this is not a trap? How do I know you are not working for my father? Because if your father knew what your mother hid, he would have already destroyed it. Come now, before someone else figures out what she left behind. The line went dead. I sat in bed for maybe 60 seconds, weighing my options. This could be a trap. This could be someone trying to lure me to an isolated cemetery in the middle of the night for reasons I did not want to think about. Or this could be exactly what the voice claimed, evidence that my mother had left behind because she knew my father was dangerous. I got dressed, grabbed my phone and car keys, and drove to Riverside Cemetery without telling Claire or anyone else where I was going, which is how I ended up standing in a graveyard at 2:15 in the morning, my phone's flashlight barely cutting through the fog, looking for a stone angel near my mother's grave. I found it exactly where the voice had described. A weathered stone angel, wings spread, standing guard over someone who had died 15 years ago. I knelt beside it and felt around the base, looking for anything that might be hidden there. The ground was cold and damp, the grass soaked with dew and fog. My fingers scraped against stone and dirt, searching for something that might not even be there. For a moment, I thought the whole thing had been a sick prank, someone's idea of a twisted joke at my expense. And then my fingers found it. A gap between the stone and the ground, wider than it should have been. I pulled at the edge, and a section of the landscaping cloth came loose, revealing a plastic container about the size of a shoebox, sealed with waterproof tape. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. This was real. Someone had hidden something here, and they had called me to come find it. My mother had hidden something here. I pulled it out with trembling hands and opened it. Inside was a notebook, one of those standard composition notebooks that students use in school. My mother's handwriting covered the pages in her neat, precise script. I angled my phone's light to read the first page, and the words hit me like a physical blow. If you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and I was right to be afraid. I sank down onto the damp grass beside my mother's grave and started reading. And with each page, I felt my understanding of the past few weeks completely transform. My mother had not just discovered my father's affair 2 weeks before her death. She had known about it for 6 months. She had hired a private investigator, documented everything, and built a case for divorce that would have left my father with almost nothing. But more than that, she had realized that my father was capable of violence. Not because he had ever hit her or threatened her, but because of what she had discovered about his mistress Vanessa. Vanessa was not just some woman my father had met and fallen in love with. Vanessa was his second wife. His legal, documented second wife, from a marriage he had apparently entered into 3 years ago without ever divorcing my mother. My father was a bigamist. He had somehow managed to marry Vanessa in Nevada while still being married to my mother in Oregon. And according to the documents my mother had gathered, Vanessa was not even the first. There had been another woman 10 years ago, another secret marriage, another betrayal. My father had a pattern. He would get bored with his current life, find a new woman, marry her secretly, maintain both relationships simultaneously for a few years, and then find a way to eliminate the old wife and move on to the new one completely. The previous wife, a woman named Margaret, had died 7 years ago from an apparent suicide. Pills and alcohol, a note about depression, no investigation because it all looked textbook. But my mother had tracked down Margaret's sister, who swore that Margaret had never been depressed, had never expressed any suicidal thoughts, had been planning to leave my father just before she died. My father was not just a cheater or a bigamist. He was potentially a serial killer who targeted his own wives when they became inconvenient. And my mother had documented all of it. Bank records showing my father withdrawing large amounts of cash that he used to maintain his secret life with Vanessa. Marriage certificates from Nevada. Photos of my father and Vanessa together. Testimony from Margaret's family about their suspicions. On the last page of the notebook, my mother had written, "I confronted Richard 2 weeks ago with everything I know. I showed him the marriage certificate from Nevada, the photos of him with Vanessa, the bank records showing the money he has been siphoning from our joint accounts to maintain his double life. I told him I knew about Margaret and what I suspected he had done to her. He tried to deny it at first, told me I was being paranoid, that I had misunderstood innocent business relationships, that the marriage certificate was a forgery created by someone trying to blackmail him. But I had too much evidence. I had been building this case for 6 months, and I had documentation for everything. When he realized I was not going to back down, when he understood that I had enough proof to destroy him in a divorce, his entire demeanor changed. The mask slipped. The loving husband, the mild-mannered accountant, the respectable retired professional. All of it fell away, and I saw something underneath that terrified me. He got very quiet, very calm, and then he told me that I had made a terrible mistake by investigating him, that I had put myself in a dangerous position, that I needed to be very careful about what I did next. I asked him if he was threatening me. He said no, of course not. He loved me and would never hurt me. But the way he said it, the look in his eyes when he said it, I knew it was a lie. I knew in that moment that I was in danger, that I had uncovered something that Richard would kill to protect. I have been afraid ever since. I see the way he looks at me now, like I am a problem that needs to be solved. like I am an obstacle between him and the life he wants with Vanessa. I see him watching me when I take my medications, offering to make me tea or coffee, being unusually attentive to my health and well-being in ways that he has not been in years. I am afraid of what he might do. I am afraid that I will end up like Margaret, another convenient death that looks natural enough to avoid investigation. So I am writing all of this down and hiding it where I hope Nathan or Claire will find it if anything happens to me. I am documenting everything I know, everything I have discovered, everything I fear. Richard does not know that I have hidden this evidence. He thinks I only have what I showed him during our confrontation. He has been trying to convince me that we can work things out, that he will end things with Vanessa, that we can stay married and put this behind us. But I have seen the calculation in his eyes. I have seen the way he is planning something. If you are reading this, my darling children, then my fears were justified. Richard has found a way to eliminate the threat I posed to his carefully constructed double life. He has made my death look natural or accidental, and he is probably already planning to move on with Vanessa, to start fresh with his new wife now that his old wife is conveniently gone. Do not let him get away with it. Do not let my death be dismissed as tragic but natural. Look at the evidence I have gathered. Question the circumstances of my death. Make sure the truth comes out. I love you both more than I can express. I am so proud of the people you have become. I am sorry that I will not be there to see you continue to grow and thrive. But I am not sorry for investigating your father and discovering the truth, even though it has put me in danger. Because you deserve to know who he really is. You deserve to be protected from him. Be brave. Be smart. Be careful. And know that whatever happens, I fought for you until the very end. Your loving mother, Elizabeth. I do not know how long I sat there in the cemetery, reading and rereading my mother's notebook. Long enough for the fog to start lifting. Long enough for the first hints of dawn to appear on the horizon. My mother had known. She had known she was in danger, and she had tried to protect herself by documenting everything. But it had not been enough. My father had found a way to kill her anyway, had put warfarin in her system somehow, had triggered a brain hemorrhage that looked natural enough to avoid investigation. And now he was off somewhere with Vanessa, probably celebrating the fact that he had gotten away with murder again. I took photos of every page of the notebook with my phone. Then I sealed it back in the plastic container and drove straight to the Portland Police Department. The detective who took my statement was a woman named Linda Morrison, maybe 45 years old, with gray streaks in her hair and the kind of tired eyes that suggested she had heard every terrible story human beings are capable of creating. I told her everything: the affair, the bigamy, Margaret's suspicious death, my mother's fears and her documentation, the warfarin in her system, my father missing the funeral to run away with his other wife. Detective Morrison listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. This is a serious allegation, Mr. Pierce. Murder is not something we investigate lightly. I know, but the evidence is all there. My mother documented everything. The problem is that most of what you have showed me is evidence of infidelity and bigamy, which are civil and minor criminal matters. The connection to your mother's death is circumstantial. But the warfarin in her system, the timing, his motive. Warfarin can enter the body accidentally. People take the wrong pills all the time. And motive without evidence of the actual crime is just speculation. So you are not going to investigate? She sighed. I am going to look into it, but I need you to understand that this is going to be a difficult case to prove. We will need to exhume your mother's body for a more thorough examination. We will need to interview your father and Vanessa. We will need to track down documentation of these alleged secret marriages. And even then, we may not have enough to charge him with anything more serious than bigamy. My father killed my mother. I know he did. You believe he killed your mother. That is different from having proof that would convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. I left the police station feeling defeated and angry. My mother had known what was coming. She had left me evidence, had tried to protect me from my father's lies, had done everything she could to make sure the truth came out, and it still might not be enough. I spent the next 2 days working with Detective Morrison to build a case. We found records of my father's marriage to Vanessa in Nevada, which was indeed valid even though he was still married to my mother. We tracked down Margaret's family, who confirmed that they had always been suspicious of her death, but never had enough evidence to push for an investigation. We got warrants for my father's phone records and financial records, showing a pattern of deception that went back more than a decade. And slowly, piece by piece, we built a case that Richard Pierce was not just a bigamist and a cheater, but a calculated killer who had murdered at least one wife and possibly two. 3 days after the funeral, when my father returned from his business trip with Vanessa, he was arrested at the Portland airport. The charges were bigamy, financial fraud, and suspicion of murder in the deaths of Elizabeth Pierce and Margaret Hendricks. The look on his face when the police approached him was something I will never forget. Not fear or guilt or even surprise. Just cold, calculated assessment like he was already planning his defense strategy. Vanessa, standing next to him with their vacation luggage, started screaming when she realized what was happening. You said she killed herself. You said you were a widower. You lied to me. Shut up, Vanessa, my father said calmly. Do not say another word until we have lawyers. But Vanessa did not shut up. She turned on him completely, telling the police everything she knew about Margaret's death, about my mother's confrontation, about conversations she had overheard where my father talked about needing to handle the problem of his first wife discovering the truth. With Vanessa's testimony and my mother's documentation and the Warfern evidence, the district attorney's office felt confident enough to add first-degree murder charges for my mother's death and to reopen the investigation into Margaret's death. The trial took 11 months. I had to watch my father sit in that courtroom, calm and composed, while prosecutors laid out the evidence of his crimes. He never showed remorse. He never admitted guilt. He maintained his innocence even when the evidence against him became overwhelming. His defense attorney tried to paint him as a victim of circumstance, a man who had made mistakes in his personal life but was not a murderer. They argued that the warfarin could have been accidentally ingested, that my mother's brain hemorrhage was a tragic but natural medical event, that Margaret's suicide was exactly what it appeared to be. But the prosecution had Vanessa. They had her testimony about conversations where my father had talked about solving the problem of my wife. They had financial records showing he had researched the effects of warfarin overdose on the internet 2 weeks before my mother died. They had my mother's notebook, her careful documentation of his pattern of behavior, her fear that she would be next. And they had me. I testified for 2 full days about discovering the affair, about my mother's suspicious death, about my father's complete lack of emotion at her funeral. The defense attorney tried to make me look like a son who had turned against his father out of anger about the affair rather than genuine evidence of murder. But the jury saw through it. I watched the jurors' faces as they listened to the evidence. I saw the moment when each of them stopped giving my father the benefit of the doubt and started believing he was guilty. It happened at different times for different people, but by the end of the prosecution's case, I could tell they had all reached the same conclusion. My father had killed my mother, and he was going to pay for it. The jury took less than 4 hours to find him guilty of first-degree murder in my mother's death and second-degree murder in Margaret's death. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. As they led him out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he looked at me one time, and I saw nothing in his eyes. No love for his son, No regret for what he had done. Just cold calculation and anger at being caught. That was 2 years ago. My sister Claire and I are still processing everything that happened, still trying to understand how we lived with a monster for so many years without seeing what he really was. Claire is in therapy, working through her complicated feelings about a father who turned out to be a murderer. I am in therapy too, trying to deal with the trauma of discovering the truth and the guilt of not seeing it sooner. My mother is still buried at Riverside Cemetery, but now there is a marker on her grave that tells a different story than we originally planned. Instead of just her name and dates, Claire and I added an inscription: Elizabeth Pierce, beloved mother, sister, friend. She found the truth and tried to protect those she loved. I visit her grave sometimes, usually early in the morning when the cemetery is quiet and I can talk to her without being interrupted. I tell her about my life, about Claire and her kids, about the scholarship fund we set up in her name for nursing students. And I thank her for being brave enough to investigate my father, smart enough to document what she found, and loving enough to make sure that even after death, she could protect her children from his lies. The notebook she left at her grave saved my life, I think, because I have no doubt that once my father had successfully gotten away with killing my mother, once he had established his life with Vanessa and settled into his new identity, he would have eventually found ways to eliminate any loose ends that might expose his crimes. And Claire and I, with our questions and our suspicions, would have been the biggest loose ends of all. I also think about that phone call in the middle of the night, the distorted voice that led me to my mother's evidence. Detective Morrison told me they were never able to trace the call, that whoever made it had used sophisticated spoofing technology to make it appear to come from my mother's disconnected number. To this day, I do not know who made that call or how they knew about the notebook my mother had hidden. The only people who could have known were my mother herself, and she was dead. Unless she had told someone else about her insurance policy, someone she trusted to make sure I found it if anything happened to her. I like to think it was one of her friends from the hospital where she worked for so many years. Some nurse or doctor who my mother had confided in, who had promised to help if anything went wrong, who had waited until after the funeral to make sure I found what my mother had left for me. Or maybe, in some way I cannot explain or understand, it was my mother herself. One last act of love and protection from beyond the grave, making sure her son found the truth even after she was gone. I do not know if I believe in ghosts or life after death or any of that, but I know that my mother's love was powerful enough to reach across death itself and save me from my father's lies. And that is more than enough for me. 2 years later, I am still teaching about history to my students, but now I have a more personal understanding of how the past can hide terrible secrets, how the people we trust can betray us in the most fundamental ways, how sometimes the only way to find justice is to be willing to dig up truths that everyone else wants to keep buried. My father will spend the rest of his life in prison, and I am okay with that. Not happy about it because it means accepting that my father is a monster who killed the woman I loved most in the world. But okay with it because it means he will never hurt anyone else the way he hurt my mother and Margaret. Vanessa, meanwhile, had her marriage to my father annulled and left town immediately after the trial. I have no idea where she is now, and I do not care. She was complicit in my father's crimes, even if she did not know the full extent of them, and I have no sympathy for the consequences she faces. Claire and I are closer now than we have ever been. Shared trauma has a way of either destroying relationships or forging them into something stronger, and fortunately for us, it was the latter. We talk almost every day. We make sure to celebrate holidays together. We keep my mother's memory alive for Claire's children, who were too young to really remember their grandmother but deserved to know what kind of woman she was. The first year after the trial was the hardest for both of us. Claire struggled with nightmares about our father, with paranoia about whether she might have inherited some kind of darkness from him, with guilt about all the signs she had missed. She kept asking herself how she could have lived with a monster for 26 years and never suspected what he was capable of. I went through the same spiral of self-blame. I had lived with him for 29 years. I had trusted him, loved him, looked up to him as a role model. And the entire time, he had been capable of murdering the women he claimed to love. What did that say about me? About my judgment? About my ability to see people for who they really are? Our therapists helped us understand that we could not have known. That my father was a skilled manipulator who had spent decades perfecting his mask of normalcy. That even trained professionals often cannot identify psychopaths until after they have committed terrible crimes. That we were victims too in our own way of his deception. But understanding something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things. We still struggle sometimes with the weight of what happened, with the knowledge that half of our DNA comes from a man who killed our mother. And every year on the anniversary of my mother's death, Claire and I go to Riverside Cemetery together. We bring flowers. We clean her gravestone. We sit on the grass beside her and talk about our lives and our memories and our hopes for the future. The first anniversary was the hardest. We both broke down crying, unable to hold ourselves together in the face of everything we had lost. Not just our mother, but our entire understanding of our family, our childhood, the story we had told ourselves about who we were and where we came from. Claire brought her kids that year, even though they were young and did not fully understand what had happened. She wanted them to know their grandmother's grave, to feel some connection to the woman they would never really know. I watched my niece and nephew place flowers on the gravestone, their small hands careful and reverent, and I felt a surge of grief so powerful it nearly knocked me over. These children would grow up knowing that their grandfather was a murderer, that their grandmother was killed by the man who was supposed to love and protect her. What kind of legacy was that to carry? But then my nephew, who was 5 at the time, looked up at me and said, "Uncle Nathan, Mommy says Grandma was brave, that she saved you. Is that true?" And I realized that we had a choice about what story we told. We could focus on the horror and the betrayal and the violence. Or we could focus on my mother's courage, her intelligence, her love that was powerful enough to reach beyond death itself to protect her children. "Yes," I told my nephew, "your grandma was the bravest person I ever knew, and she loved us so much that she found a way to keep us safe, even after she was gone." That became the story we told. Not about how she died, but about how she lived. About how she faced evil and documented it and made sure the truth would come out. About how she loved her children enough to fight for justice even when she knew it might cost her everything. Last year, on what would have been my mother's 65th birthday, something strange happened at her grave. Claire and I had just finished our visit and were walking back to our cars when I noticed something I had never seen before. A single white rose, fresh and perfect, lying on top of the stone angel where my mother had hidden her notebook. There was no card, no note, no indication of who had left it. Just a white rose on the anniversary of her birth, placed on the exact spot where she had hidden the evidence that would bring down her killer. Claire thought it was just a coincidence, some mourner leaving flowers on the wrong grave. But I knew better. Somewhere out there, someone was watching over my mother's memory. Someone who knew what she had done and wanted to honor her courage. I picked up the rose and brought it to my mother's grave, placing it gently on the fresh flowers we had just laid down. "Thank you," I said quietly. Not sure if I was talking to my mother or to whoever had left the rose or to the universe in general. "Thank you for making sure the truth came out." The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the trees. But for just a moment, I could have sworn I felt something. Presence. A warmth. A sense that somehow, somewhere, my mother was at peace knowing that her death had not been in vain. That she had protected her children one last time, even from the grave. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Before you go, I have left 2 more stories here on your screen. Both from men who discovered that family is not always who you are born to, it is who stands by you when the truth comes out. Click on whichever one calls to you. And if you want to join our community of people who understand what it is like to be the outsider looking in, that notification bell is your invitation. Until tomorrow, remember your story matters even if they tried to erase it.